All right, greetings, you happily miserable accursed. I'm so goddamn happy to say that on this Labor Day Monday, we have assembled all three of our political strategy supervillains here on the pod. The original Mr. X, Scott Xavier Reid, Woodpecker Rising, Kory Teneycke, and left-wing Lady Vulture, Jordan Leichnitz. And of course, I'm David Droughtmaker Herle. What a week, team, and what a beginning to it already. Minister Clark has just resigned earlier today. We will talk about all the latest developments in the Greenbelt saga. Our cursed clipping is Althea Raj's piece in The Star on Jagmeet Singh and the NDP's fall strategy to make policy progress and gain support. And then there's just 1 month until the Manitoba election, probably going to be called tomorrow. We'll dive into the campaigns there. And then, as always, Gordon Pinsent and our Hey Yous. Kory, Jordan, Scott, it's great to have you all back here. Jordan, what are you doing working on Labor Day? You, of all people, should have...
You should be in a parade with your sisters and brothers.
I will be going to a parade later, so thank you for the plug for that. But what better way to celebrate solidarity with working people than spending time with you three? So happy Labor Day, comrades. I hope you enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, sister. Okay. I mean, I would love to talk about the Rider game, but unfortunately we have to talk about a different kind of green, the green belt. Another busy week on this front. The minister's resignation this morning. It's going to be interesting to see whether this is water on the fire or gas on the fire. I'm out of the business of trying to predict when a scandal is fatal or not because the rules on this are changing so quickly. So I don't know whether Ford loses over this, but this issue is going to stick. And I don't think the government has a credible story, certainly not as long as they stick with the outcome of a process they themselves have described as flawed. I think if Ford wants people to believe he's not complicit and not happy with the outcome, he has very little time to reverse this and start afresh. Scott, what's your take?
Exactly that. I think, this is so, and I'm sorry, Kory, you're sitting right there. It feels weird, but this is so uncharacteristic of the Ford government's issues management style. Usually, let's forget the first year, forget the Dean French, alternate universe in which the Ford government operated for the first year before people said, Jesus Christ, we've got to get in a time machine and fucking butterfly effect our way out of this government, right? And since that point, when Ford hits trouble, he'll spend a couple days, like all political leaders, going, no, it's not a problem. No, stop. You're wrong. I'm right. And then he'll just get up one day and go, all right, everybody else is right. I'm wrong. Golly gee willikers, folks. I'm so sorry. I got it wrong. And you know what? We're going to try to do the right thing and reverse his course completely. And that usually stems it. And then he also has the added benefit that everybody thinks he's kind of the A&W root beer bear and kind of too dumb to really run a government, therefore too dumb to be accountable. And therefore they go, well, shit, it wasn't really his fault. He didn't really know what was going on. And at least he's doing the right thing by apologizing. And so he skates away on this stuff. This is not what they've done. This drip of, we're not going to let Amato resign. Amato's resigning. We're not going to fire Steve Clark. Steve Clark gets fired. Like this drip is uncharacteristic of the way the government handles this. And arguably, I think inarguably, this is the most serious challenge that it's faced. And I have a suspicion that's because of this $8.3 billion fucking dollars that's at the middle of it. And so when you say to people, sorry, the only way to actually stem this tide is to reverse that process, initiate a new process, have some independent arbiter that allows you to demonstrate that it's legitimate and transparent, that's going to open you up to a lot of lawyering and you're going to get sued. And I'm sure the Ministry of the Attorney General is saying, well, we don't have a shaky leg to stand on, so we're going to get pounded. And they don't want to do it politically and so on and so forth. But I think that's the inevitable outcome of this. I think if you rush to the end, either very soon, the Premier recognizes that Amato and Clark's resignations are insufficient to quell this storm. Therefore, he'll have to reverse the process and re-adjudicate those parcels of land. I think he can still try to hang on to the process in the policy. But if he chooses not to do that, he'll just do it in the end and he'll just suffer more damage And at some point, I don't know when, it's alchemy, it's witchcraft, but at some point, words cronyism and corruption stick to you, especially when people are talking about $1 million success fees and the likes of Mr. X and Phoenix fucking kiss, baby. He looks like he is a credible character. So that's where I think this goes. I just don't know how quickly it goes. I think inevitably they're going to have to completely eat themselves and reverse the policy in whole. You're on mute, David.
Phoenix is a frugal man, though, because he doesn't take the cigar out of the package.
Yeah, well,
right?
It could be.
So
maybe health reasons.
Still, it's all about the vibes.
So I'm going to let Kory back clean up. Jordan, let's come to you and get your take on this, but let me just throw at you. I mean, I don't understand, after Amato resigns and Clark is gone, how the government even sticks to the outcome. Like, I mean, they've now acknowledged that so much was wrong with this. How can they still defend the outcome?
Well, I wouldn't want to be in that meeting, but I imagine that there's a metric fuck ton of lawyers involved, and that's really what's holding all of this up. But yeah, I think I agree with almost everything Scott said in terms of what the trajectory is on this. I think it has been uncharacteristic of the Ford government in terms of how long the hemorrhaging has gone on. And this is, to my mind, this is like one of the most dangerous potential scandals for the Ford government because it goes right to core brand issues. It takes an issue, remember back in the day, where Kory, where this was about housing. It's no longer about fucking housing, right? This is now about who of the friends of the Ford government are making billions of dollars. And that's just deadly because the notion that Ford is governing in the interests of his buddies is probably the biggest weak point in his overall image with Ontarians, and the polls bear that out. And I think it's, we're already starting to see like a little bit of movement that this might be sticking. And I haven't actually seen fresh numbers that came out since the Integrity Commissioner report. So chances are that that's going to deepen. I think for the NDP, there's no question, this is a huge, huge, huge opportunity. Marit has done fairly well in terms of being focused on it. And, it was her report to the Integrity Commissioner that kind of got things going. So I think they need to keep hammering on that to squeeze Liberals out of the story. But more than anything, it's this lengthy issues management crawl to the inevitable outcome that I think is bleeding the Ford government in a really potentially very damaging way.
Kory, I'm just going to say to you that none of this has your fingerprints on it, and I blame Europe.
Yeah, right. Oh, I'm getting married. Oh, I'm going to take my eye off the ball. Oh,
too much parade time. Sorry.
I'm going to do a dad brag off the top because the biggest thing I did this weekend was move my eldest son into residence at UT to start university, which was sort of a bittersweet parental life moment, and feel a little bit conflicted about it, but very happy and very proud of my son.
He's studying
Marcus.
Philosophy, right?
He is indeed.
That's great. His membership card's in the mail. That's perfect.
U of T wouldn't let me in. Fuck that school.
Yeah, right. So aside from that, how was your weekend? Well, it's been an interesting day thus far. Look, I hear the criticism, but I will say that you can always make things worse, and you've touched on some of the ways to do that, and so I think not all decisions and not all things that you do in government are going to go over the way you anticipated, and sometimes unwinding some of them is much more difficult than others, but. I do think the Ford government has done a good job of keeping the focus on housing overall, and time will tell as to the efficacy of that, right? But all the polling I've seen on the Greenbelt, changing the Greenbelt isn't the problem. Motive around it is the issue, and you're speaking to brand issue. That's all true. Look, and also even things like removal of ministers and things like that are. Having people resign, and my understanding is that Clark did legitimately resign. I think that's for those of us who like ministerial accountability, that's a good thing. Clark has been one of the, in my view, and I've got a pretty close view, one of the more capable people in this government. I've got a lot of time for the guy. I think he's a good communicator with a good grasp of policy, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody bats 1,000, and sometimes you end up in a position where things don't go your way. And, I think accepting responsibility and handling it that way is a sign of maturity and team play and all those kinds of things, which I think we should see more of in politics generally. So we'll see what happens over the coming weeks. But I think at the end of the day, one of the most poignant issues out there will continue to be housing. And, the government will be judged on its record on that at the end of the day. And, and the opposition party saying, don't build here, don't build there, don't build over there, some other place, is really off message for what the electorate wants to hear, a huge swath of it. So, I think there's an ability to make lemonade. As for, how bad things are, et cetera, look, a year out from the last campaign, Ford was in the low 30s and promising to throw 12-year-olds in jail if they dared to go into a park during the pandemic. So, there's a desire sometimes in analysis and punditry to draw hockey stick lines to infinity on these kinds of things. That's never been my experience. So I think there's lots of time to course correct. We'll see what happens.
Well, before he loses, somebody has to be able to win. And so far, neither of the opposition parties really has established themselves as a threat to win an election in Ontario. So there is that. But Scott, if I listened carefully to what Kory was saying, I would be expecting some unwinding of this outcome. And going back at other land in the Greenbelt. And I think he's right. I think that the Greenbelt issue, I think they'll skate on that. I think that if they come up with a way of allocating land from the Greenbelt that looks like it doesn't enrich people, that they're going to be back on the housing bandwagon. But that would have to be something that was seen as Ford's initiative. He would have
pretty
to take
big distance from here to there.
It is.
Well, I think there are another many other options in between the two that are viable. One of the best things, not that we're going to get into all the policy of this, but one of the things that I think is best about the process that is going on around the Greenbelt is there's a shot clock on it. And if those houses aren't built within a prescribed period of time, the land goes back. And, and I think that is a good way of regaining motive around this stuff. I also think that those kinds of shot clocks should be on development changes and land designation changes more generally. We have a weird situation where the paper trade of municipal designations for housing and development are a thing in and of themselves, where people are either getting a change in designation and they're using that as leverage to get additional funding from a bank or another financial institution to go and buy more land, or they're squatting on it for, God knows how long, till the value appreciates.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I hear you on all that. We've already conceded that we think that you guys are winning on the policy argument and that you're owning the housing issue, and that gives you a strong position. But I would just say this.
There are a lot of things that you can do other than, a complete reversal.
Well, I guess we'll see. But it's 12:17 p.m. on Monday as we speak. So we'll have to see how the afternoon unfolds. I would just make this raw political and issues management observation. Steve Clark's resignation makes no sense in isolation. It harms in isolation. It doesn't calm the waters, it chums the waters. And so to me, there needs to be, and almost certainly will be, a corresponding policy announcement. I just think because you can't, even if he said, Premier, I simply refuse to accept that you won't accept my resignation, even if it went into one of those conversations, which I don't believe, but even if it did, you still have to take this moment and do something with it. You have to, because none of the arguments that Kory is making get heard. You can't go into that place until you've rolled this rock of the awarding. You can't say, listen, all these bad guys are using this money, to purchase wings and hospitals. It doesn't matter how it is employed. If the process is ill-gotten, then that delegitimizes everything politically and policy-wise. And so I just think we're going to get a reversal.
What we were saying. Totally. But to go back to what we were saying at the beginning about Ford and his persona, it's quite possible that if he stands up and does that whole Jesus Christ, this was a fucking mess, right? And,
I agree.
got new people in charge and we're going to start again. This could roll off him.
It'll bounce off him like a cookie off his belly.
I think, though, it heartens me to hear Kory talk about middle paths and such, because I think that's fucking deadly. I think anything that delays clean cut on this is awful. So I think that's great advice.
You're bingo bango on that.
And the other thing that interests me is, do we have all the facts? Do we have the full story? Are there any shoes left to drop on this? And if there are, which I suspect there may be.
There could be Mr. X, Mr. Y, and Mr. Z.
Who knows, right? And like what we've seen already is pretty fucking shady by absolutely every interpretation of the law and common practice around lobbying and whatnot. So I think that's another factor here, is if we don't yet have the complete story, some of these things may make more sense in retrospect, but the longer the Ford government takes to get to the inevitable conclusion, the more harm will be done to Ford's personal brand that he can't aw shucks his way out of.
It's always your fucking shifty friends that get you in trouble when you're in government, eh? It's always Frank fucking Moores or Jacques Corriveau or fucking John.
And it's never the ones that, I know this sounds self-rewarding, but it's never the ones that are in the tight circle that are actually like, listen, like we got to do this thing, and that may not be in my interest, but Premier, Prime Minister is what you got. It's always the guy who was sort of like, I knew him in grade 7, we were good friends, and now like I'm just walking around with his face on my business card and trying to just milk fucking money out of the government cow. Like it's always that sleazeball.
Yeah. Kory, you good, or do you want to wrap up?
I'm happy to move on.
This is the best curse of politics ever. All right. All right. So where were we? Yes. I wound up last week's message from our presenting sponsor, TELUS, by promising you some data on what happened in other countries when they went all in on a government policy that lets wholesalers resell access to an established carrier's network. I want to make something clear off the top. Wholesaling arrangements made cooperatively between carriers has existed for many years. What we're talking about here is requiring wholesale access at an artificially low mandated rate set by the government. That's called a mandated regime for those taking notes. Hurly-burlyites, I'm not one to quibble when data strongly suggests there's nothing to quibble about. So here are the facts. In Europe, several governments doubled down on mandated regimes, mainly for wireline services, to drive price competition at the cost of everything else. Cost them? It did, because it disincentivized carriers investing in their networks. In 2021, total telecom capital expenditures, or investments per person, dropped precipitously, 66% lower than the same measure in Canada. Quality took a nosedive. Average download speeds decayed, 20% lower in the EU than in Canada. Because think about it. If you were TELUS, or any carrier, why would you continue to invest in your infrastructure? Why would you keep innovating when other companies can just come in, ride your lines, and take advantage of everything that you've built at an artificially low mandated price you're forced to accept? In Europe, regulators are now looking for solutions to fill that huge investment gap. Price is one thing, investment and continued improvement is another, and it's critical to get the balance right. Particularly so, given what needs to still be done to connect remaining rural communities and drive innovation in wireless by implementing 5G across Canada. More on this in the weeks to come. Much more. Our clipping today comes to us courtesy of Althea Raj in the Toronto Star. And this was one of a couple of articles in this nature this week. So I presume Mr. Singh was out giving interviews. And Althea is writing about the confidence and supply agreement and what might be an opportunity for the NDP to use the Liberals' current low polling numbers as a way to leverage more stuff out of it. Here's an excerpt. Singh hopes to sit down with the Prime Minister in mid-September when Trudeau returns from the G20 meeting in India, but the list of demands is already being formed. The party wants to see more affordability measures, such as last year's doubling of the GST credit, a robust plan to address the housing crisis, and tangible measures on the climate front to help people protect their homes and communities from severe weather events. Their proposals, of course, clash with Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's message to Cabinet last month that there is no more money. The NDP wants the federal government not just to incentivize private developers to build by dropping the GST or affordable rental projects, for example, but by building housing itself on federal lands and newly purchased land. But part of Singh's tightrope act is knowing what the Liberals might be willing to do and what they aren't. There is no point publicly demanding something that is unlikely to get done. He risks looking like he has no influence. So look to the fall economic statement to see if Singh's been successful. But even if he hasn't, don't expect him to trigger the government's downfall. Kory, let me start with you. The last statement is the most important one, isn't it? In these negotiations, what's his or else?
Well, like that's all. That's 100% of his leverage. It's not half his leverage. It's not 10% of his leverage. 100% of his leverage is to collapse the government at a time where they're very politically vulnerable, I believe. So if he's going in with that, then I think he's lost before he even starts. And I don't get that negotiating strategy at all.
So why are they reluctant to bring down the government? Jordan.
What?
Jordan, you tell us. Why are they reluctant to bring down the government?
I mean, I think the same reason the Liberals are reluctant to go to an election. It's right now we're dealing with a significant and sustained conservative rise in the polls. And for the NDP, their numbers have largely held steady, but there's no guarantee about what the outcome looks like and whether they end up with the amount of leverage that they currently have, right? So what they have right now is some tools to get some stuff out of the government. And I had to laugh at the headline on the Raj piece and a couple of others as though it's like scandalous that he would put them over a barrel. Like that's called politics. That is exactly how this agreement is supposed to work. And I think that, this storyline or, what the party's been pushing out over the last few days, but I like it. I think that more aggressive tone is useful for them. I think they need to remind voters that they're here, that they are exacting things out of the government, things that have to do with people's experience with cost of living. That's all to the good. Look, I mean, whether he's serious about pulling the plug or not, like I think we all know he gets to hit the big red button once. So he's going to choose his moment carefully on that. But I think the biggest danger for them is actually making their price too low, too many demands, too muddied. That's actually the biggest risk there. I think they need to pick one issue and hone in on it. I think it should be housing. And I think that they need to put their stamp on it in a way that actually resonates with voters, not necessarily in a transactional sense, but they just need to be out there branded to the issue and continuing to be seen to squeeze the Liberals on it. That's the most important thing for them. And you've seen already in the last few weeks that they've started to be taking the fight directly to Poilievre on this issue. And I think that's the place that they need to be. And so this can all help towards that. So frankly, I was happy to see this spin coming out from them this week. I think it's where they need to be for the fall.
Scott, how much of this is a difference between what's in the NDP's interest and what's in Jagmeet Singh's interest? Like, there's every reason to believe that the NDP might not do particularly well in an election held right now, but there's also reason to believe that the government would get stomped badly. And in the Leighton years, the NDP thought that a bad day for the Liberal Party was a good day for the NDP. But Leighton had job security. Singh's probably done if he loses another election, right? So how much of this I don't want to force an election right now is Singh not wanting to force an election right now rather than it's not in the NDP's interest, do you think?
I think the interests are congruent. I think you're correct. I think that Singh can't afford an election that doesn't produce a result that sees him grow seats, the government diminished or defeated, and that he has power in a new minority situation. Anything else spells as Waterloo. But I also think that what's true for Singh personally is true for the NDP comprehensively, which is that, this for all the reasons that Jordan just articulated, this is a bad looking scenario. And for that reason, by and large, I think this is meaningless. Like, I think literally like what we're talking about is something that does not matter. I think that you enter into, I do think there'll be some discussions. I think they'll produce an update to the CNS agreement. I think that matters in the sense that it confirms that Trudeau will be able to skate for another year or two. And you want to get through these economic times. I don't think it matters in terms of where we end up in an election, though, because if you can't force an election, then there's not going to be an election. If you can't demand something that the government isn't willing and able to deliver, then that means you can only ask for things that the government is happy to deliver, which, by the way, means things that the government will take credit for and be able to campaign on again. Whether that helps them or not, I don't know, but it means that Singh can't mow Trudeau's lawn in any fundamental way. So, I mean, I know there's this school of thought, which is, well, if we demonstrate while in Parliament is sitting that we can get things done for people, that will reward us electorally. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that's ever been true. I don't believe that was actually the lesson of Leighton. I believe the lesson of Leighton is get close to the end of an election where the Liberals look like they're really fading, and then a la 2011, and then you can springboard, and that could happen. But I don't think it's going to happen because of what's going to be negotiated in the CNS updated agreement. I think they're got a bunch of affordability things that probably makes allows Singh to message a little more resonantly with where Canadians are. It would allow Trudeau, if he was willing, to message in a place that's a little more resonant with where Canadians are. They start talking about affordability rather than another broad government program. But I don't think it's going to be that consequential. Other than saying, okay, they're going to lock in this parliament for another couple of years.
I think the other thing to remember is just that, like, when this agreement was first reached 18 months ago, the housing and the affordability issues were not they had not crystallized as the top of mind voter issues the way they have today. So the question of whether there's any juice to be squeezed on that within the Liberal government, I think hasn't yet really been fully tested. And so that's yet another reason that the idea of them going back and getting a bit of a second wash on the agreement, I think, is smart for both parties. That's something that benefits the Liberals and the New Democrats there. And I think that there are some pieces that they may be able to get agreement on.
Jordan, I just don't understand. I don't understand this for the life of me. I do not.
I don't. And I think
you're going to have to explain this to me, Jordan. I don't understand this for the life of me. Scott's talking about your accomplishments, the NDP's accomplishments, and in this deal. And when I had Coletto and Dan Arnold on the Hurley-Burley, neither of them thought that anybody in Canada was aware that dental care had been the NDP's idea and pushed it, or that the GST credit was the NDP's idea and they'd pushed it. If anybody was getting credit for those things, it wasn't the NDP in particular. And this is going to be, 2025 is going to be a clear change election. When and how do the NDP get on the change side of it?
So a couple points. I think we've talked a little bit about before. I also don't subscribe to the theory that this agreement is going to benefit the NDP in that exact transactional way that Canadians are going to say, thank you, Jagmeet Singh, for dental care. I will therefore vote for you. I don't think that's how this works. I do think, though, that what it does is it does provide an answer to some of the competence questions that sometimes dog the NDP. And that can be pretty significant if you are in a situation where you get a little bit of lift in those polls. You want to have that sense of competence as a bit of a backstop. I think that far more important than the confidence and supply agreement is whether Singh himself is able to connect with voters with a sense that he understands their challenges. And we've talked about this before. He does have some challenges in conveying that image, but I think that the first step on that path is occupying the space in opposition to Poilievre's version of that, which they're beginning to do, taking the fight to Poilievre, being the one who's going to offer that. I think that what has to break apart a little bit is the orthodox thought that if New Democrats campaign against Conservatives, it will only strengthen the Liberals. I don't think that is necessarily true this campaign. And I think you're going to see the party leaning further into some of those attacks on the Conservatives because the Liberals have completely abdicated that space. And I think that that's going to be significant. The benefits of the agreement are also time. It's time for the NDP, just as it is time for the Liberals, time to settle past election debt and build a war chest for the next campaign. And I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the issues that are the strongest fundraising among the NDP base, things like going after the Conservatives, are the ones that you're seeing Jagmeet doing now. So it gives them time to set the table, and it allows the table to be set a little bit more favorably, particularly in some of those blue-orange fights that are going to be so crucial to the party in parts of Ontario, the Prairies, and BC.
So another summer has slipped away, the way summers do. Canadians are shaking the lake water out of their minds and getting back to work. This week, millions of students head back to school. Some of them, someday, will take their places in locomotive cockpits. They will become conductors or engineers, responsible for piloting a 200-ton iron behemoth, often pulling more than 100 rail cars from origin to destination safely and on time. It's kind of an awesome responsibility. Remember, we're talking about a machine with a stunning level of sheer inertia once it's moving. At cruising speed, it takes a mile or more to stop. And every day, locomotives make their way through Canadian cities. So you can probably imagine the care with which train conductors are selected and trained. Our sponsor, CN, operates 2 campuses, one in Winnipeg, the other in Homewood, Illinois. All Canadian employees are trained in Winnipeg. Conductors learn to conduct minute inspections for hazards that, if left uncorrected, can lead to disaster. They learn to live by life-critical rules and the consequences for ignoring those rules. They go over the lessons learned by their predecessors, and they are taught to anticipate. They learn techniques for sure-footed walking on hazardous surfaces and something called slow brain focus when carrying out train inspections. They use model trains to understand the mechanics of switching cars in a rail yard. CN is even developing something called a slacker simulator, which replicates the surges and lapses of inertial force when powering up or slowing down a train. And all CN's new conductors, on graduation, take an oath and ring a bell as they leave campus, a final signification of total dedication to safety. Even at that, they will return to class every couple of years for retraining and recertification. They never stop going back to school, in other words. Like I said, it's a big job.
Can we not come back to the very first question you asked, David, around this? Why would you give up your leverage and say, by saying it, you're not going to call an election? I think it's because they're broke and they're low in the polls. Like these are 2 truths. Like if you were to take the average since the last election of where the NDP is, comes out at about 18 points pretty consistently. 18 points is a fucking disaster for the NDP, in my view, because 18 is more likely to be 16 because you tend to bleed another 2 to the Liberals in the final 10 days of the campaign. That's been the dynamic of almost every election that we've had in the last 30 years. So,
or here's a thought: nobody wants a fucking election. Not
no,
voters.
I think the Conservatives want an election,
well, sure. But
and I think a lot of Canadians want an election.
I don't think a lot of Canadians want an election.
Oh, really? Well, because change elections are generally driven by a desire to change the government and a desire to see something different happening. You're seeing very, very, very little of Jagmeet. Like if we're to do an analysis of what happened this summer, the Prime Minister seemed distracted, had a fake cabinet shuffle that didn't really shake the table at all. And, was probably spending a lot of time dealing with some challenging things in his personal life, which, I think we all can feel for him on. But I think it was distracted and ineffectual, and they went down in the polls. I think Jagmeet was in the witness protection program this summer. I didn't really see fucking anything from him. And I think that's deadly for him too. So, insofar as having this conversation gives him some relevancy and that he's, actually in the media a little bit, I think it's probably positive for them. However, the person who was the big winner this summer is clearly Poilievre. And the only person who is actually raising significant amounts of money and seems ready to litigate an election campaign if it were held tomorrow is the Conservative Party. So, I don't know. We'll see. Well, I think they're hanging on because they don't.
Pretty hard to say nobody wants an election when the polls say 80% of the people want to change government.
That's exactly right.
I presume that most of those 80% would welcome an election. Scott, what do you think?
Well, I mean, first of all, nobody wants a fucking election, and
whatever.
And no, but I'm just saying, Jordan's like, nobody wants a fucking election, and then Kory's like, Singh's been in fucking witness protection. Can we just clean it up folks. Okay, can we just like, you know, we're not in the Navy. Okay, come on.
The Navy.
It's the church of politics, not the curse of politics. We're changing it.
Well, isn't that special?
Yeah.
I see that someone's slipped by Queen's Park. Could it be Satan?
No, I left there this morning. It's fine.
Yeah. I'll just add one more thing, and it sort of rips off the last point that Kory said. I think that there's a devil's bargain in all of this for both the NDP and the Liberals, and the only thing that's genuinely secured is time, and time to hope that you can come up with a strategy, time to that the economy will start to repair itself, and that the Liberals will repair their approach to the economy. Time for the NDP to figure out a way to leverage and flip all this thing into some kind of electoral advantage. I don't know if that time will reward them, but it is the only it's the only benefit of this agreement, and I think that that's why it makes sense for both of them and why there won't be an election. But I also think this thing, its existence, and you've made this point, David, I think it gives a renewed agreement. If you have like sometime in September, if you have a renewed agreement, a press release issued about it and yada, 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 and some fanfare around it, I think that helps Poilievre. Like, I know the government must do it. I know the NDP must do it, but I think Poilievre gets to hold it up and say, Jesus Christ, man, this is a bargain of bad, and he will do that, and it'll resonate with a bunch of people.
Two unpopular parties hanging on to power by a deal like this, yeah.
Well, he's already, I think, using to great effect the line that Singh pretends he's not a part of this government. He is the government. I'm
not sure it's to great effect. I mean, I think, frankly, the fact we're having this conversation and that Singh is out there still carving out some oppositional space to the Liberals shows that he's able to do that, you know? On
the actual policy outcomes of this, these agreements, I think they've been masterful for the NDP in the sense that it's all measures that are targeted largely to NDP voters. To the detriment of the core narrative that got this Liberal government elected, which is about being a champion for the middle class. And you're not a champion in the middle class if everything is targeted to the bottom 10% of the workforce.
Hey, you guys, I'm so obsessed with this issue. Like, Kory, you couldn't be more correct. It really, 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 really scares the bejesus out of me as a Liberal, right? You got two fundamental forces at play right now. One, a minority parliament where you've got this agreement that forces you in to a bunch of policy measures that are aimed at the lower end of the income scale, and they're government program-oriented commitments. And two, an economic circumstance coming after the pandemic that causes the government, in spite of its brand, in spite of itself, to want to not spend as much money. And so how that manifests itself is in saying, well, then let's income test and structure programs so it's aimed at those who need it most. So you end up with government. Those two forces together mean that the Liberals are all about the lower income scale.
You know that finance likes to design programs that don't actually benefit anybody.
That's right. And so, but you take these two great forces and you put them together, and you get 2, 3, 4 years of a Liberal government that is designing and delivering measures aimed heavily at the lower end of the income scale, which permits the middle class to conclude they are left out of what the Liberals are up to. And that is pure political poison.
So here's what interests me the most. And I think the NDP has a few things they can do with the time remaining in this agreement that will benefit them. And, you know, we can all agree that it's probably better for them to be in this agreement than not if you're the fourth party.
Why? I'm just going to stop you. Because I don't fucking get this. You give the Liberals more time. So now's not an ideal time for the NDP to have an election. They don't have enough money. They don't really have themselves ready. Okay, that's fair. But the 2 years gives the Liberals time to find their feet, find a message, do what Scott did, bring somebody in, bring Jerry Butts back, do whatever the fuck they need. Gives them a chance to get their shit together.
Wanting to get their shit together.
If you walked into the House this month and pulled the plug on them, if Singh walked into the House and pulled the plug on them, the Liberals would be flopping around like a fish in the bottom of a boat. They'd have no idea how to fight an election campaign. Yeah. No idea how to fight an election campaign.
I'm not sure that that's going to change in the next year. And there's no sign within the Liberal camp that there's any significant shifts coming. If they're out there saying that the likes of the cabinet shuffle from the summer is the type of reset that they're going to bring, then it doesn't matter whether they have another 6 months, 3 months, or another 18 months. They're still fucked. So the question is, what are the Liberals going to do with this time? And are they going to use it to their advantage, or are they just going to march towards the inevitable? And I'm not sure they've decided.
Speaking of this schism between the Liberals and the NDP, by the way, there's an interesting thing in this Raj article, Jordan, I'd like you to maybe educate us on a little bit, that leapt out at me, which is this anti-scab legislation in federally regulated industries, which was portrayed in the article as a core demand of the NDP. How core is it to the NDP?
Much to the disappointment of some, it's a pretty core demand. And this is one of a few sort of significant holes in Canadian labor legislation that really can stack the deck in favor of the employer in some of these disputes. And so this has long been a priority of the NDPs. In fact, I remember when Mulcair was leader and we brought it forward as a private member's bill, our first member who got the draw was strongly encouraged to select this as their legislation, because it's a clean fix to a real problem that's going to make some significant differences for workers in Canada. And so for that reason, this is an absolutely clean win that the NDP can have, that they can show this is something the Liberals would not have done without their pressure. They want this. It's going to happen.
What do you think from the Liberal side, Scott? Is this an issue that they would be? We talked about brand blurring in the past.
I don't think that it harms the Liberals. I think that the Trudeau guys have long subscribed to the view that when you line up from a priority standpoint, like in what order you do things, position yourself so that you can eat the NDP lunch electorally is job number one. I think that's always, that's to me, when you just observe them independently, that's always been their first piece. By the way, that's an extraordinarily logical thing to start with for the Liberals. So I don't think, like I hear Jordan saying, well, they wouldn't have done it if they weren't forced into it. I don't think they mind being forced into it. And I think that it allows them to lay claim. If they can get a polarizing vote in campaign against Poilievre, I think they think that's the kind of thing they'll be able to use as a credential to make it acceptable for strong NDPers to vote Liberal against the threat of Poilievre. All of it, of course, is vulnerable. Like the federal Liberals are also vulnerable to, like they got to keep the NDP 8 points down from them, right? Like if they creep closer than that at some point during an election, then things can flip, right? If people conclude that Trudeau's history, so you got to be, I'm way ahead of myself, but you got to always fear that. But I think by and large, they don't mind that blurring because they think that they'll have the whip hand and it'll allow them to rally those NDP votes behind them.
And you also have to think that for the NDP, this is exactly the kind of fight they want to have with Poilievre and the Conservatives. This is exactly what they want to do to tackle some of the push that Poilievre and the Conservatives are making with respect to workers.
That makes sense to me.
It requires the Conservatives to play along, and I think you're making a big assumption that they're going to come out and vehemently
They refused to.
oppose
Poilievre was very subtle in the way he handled the port strike. And by the way, there's never going to be a long strike at the port. No matter what the legislation says.
It's incumbent on the government to solve labor disputes like that. And as the opposition, why take on ownership? Why make that easy for them? And the big play that is continuing to go on is across the country, provincial levels and at the federal level. And I'm sure we'll get into this when we're talking about Manitoba. It's to go for private sector union support and try to pull as much of it away from the NDP as possible, and do it in a concerted, systematic, and ongoing manner. And so these assumptions that the Conservatives are going to oppose some of these things and you're going to have a wedge there, I think is increasingly doubtful.
Certainly off strategy for them, given where they're going. Yeah.
But it's a nice trap to set.
So let's swing west, not very far west, a little bit west, province of Manitoba, the less interesting of the two prairie provinces.
The Keystone Province.
Not in my world.
Right?
Manitoba election likely to be called tomorrow, although everybody has been full-blown campaigning for weeks already in anticipation. For years after Brian Pallister was hounded out of the province, the NDP have had a substantial lead over the PCs. Pallister's replacement, Heather Stevenson, seemed headed to defeat for several years. I may have made fun of it on this show once or twice. However, the race has tightened to the point where the most recent poll showed the two parties tied overall in provincial intention. Good, robust poll of 1,000 people across the province. Unfortunately, a snapshot in time, not a tracking poll, so we don't even know if that was the end point. Certainly, the trend line is up for the PCs and the trend line is down for the NDP and the Liberals, if anybody's watching that. Big lead, although a diminished lead for the NDP in Winnipeg. Huge lead and growing for the PCs in the rural seats. The Liberal vote, which is historically relevant in Winnipeg, is declining along with federal fortunes in that province. And then there's a weird racial component emerging to this campaign because Wab Kinew, the leader of the NDP, is an Indigenous person. And some people in Manitoba are talking about how things like the search for missing people in the landfill or the Conservatives' offensive on crime against the NDP are dog whistles to anti-Indigenous voters. So, Jordan, are the NDP going to win the Manitoba election?
No, I sure hope so. I think.
No, but I don't give a shit what you hope.
I like their chances, David.
If we're talking hope, I've got a whole big long list today.
Yeah, exactly.
You got a lot of hopes.
I got a lot of hopes.
Hand them over to the New Democrat. We're real good with hopes. Yeah, I mean, I really like their chances for a few reasons, and I think it's interesting to pick apart what's happened strategy wise over the summer because as you mentioned, as we kind of headed into the spring, things were quite diverged. But then the Tories spent April through July campaigning, really, using government announcements to campaign. And I think that definitely helped them. And that was something, that's a smart strategy on their part. And then in the summer, there were some of these billboards that went on crime issues. And we could definitely talk more about that. But I think it's interesting. The New Democrat campaign would just make a couple observations that they've learned some lessons from Alberta. So if you see what they're doing, you've got them out there. They campaigned very hard. They basically decided that the campaign started at the beginning of August. Well, Stevenson took the month off. So they were out there. They were able to have that time, and they're hammering their policy announcements, but they're not doing like machine gun one a day. Like they're going deep for 2 or 3 days on each one to try to let that permeate. And I think that was a lesson from Alberta, that if you spend it all when no one's really paying attention, it can blow back. So we'll see whether that strategy for August was successful. When it comes to crime, I think everybody actually should go and listen to Wab Kinew's remarks from earlier this month. So he made a fairly remarkable speech about his position on crime. And he said really the quiet part out loud when it came to this campaign. And the question is, why would Stevenson and the Conservatives make this an election about crime? They're a two-term government. She was the AG. She was involved in some of the decisions that, for example, cut funding on gangs and things like that. Technically, it is a weakness on their record. So why would you make it the core focus of your campaign? And I think that's an example. So Kinew there had dealt this hand, and he went out and he named it. And they're making a bet that Manitobans are ready for a different kind of a campaign, that they are not going to respond to those kind of dog whistles. And it's a big bet. But
because it appears they have. But now, Kory, I know you're going to have a lot to say. Can you weave into your answer, though? Can you weave into your answer a little bit of what makes Stevenson different from Pallister? I know that she has eased off on the austerity a little bit, but what else is making this work?
I think she's a very different personality, and I think it's a more appealing personality. Pallister, let's just be blunt, was always a bit of a dick. He's got a bit of a prickly persona. He's a bit, prickly. And
I just have to stop and let the record show that Kory Teneycke called a politician a bit of a dick, and that makes you part of the David Herle Club. There you go.
There you go. Exactly. Yes. I think I said prick, but 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But I've gotten to know Heather Stevenson a little bit over the last couple of years, and who does she remind me a lot of? She reminds me a lot of Scott Moe. If you were to say, "Hey, Central Casting, give me a sort of a nice, good, wholesome, prairie girl who's in politics," they hit the buzzer, and from Central Casting would come Heather Stevenson. Like, there is, I think, something that is inherently a lot more appealing about her, and I think that's helpful. So I think there's a stylistic change there. To answer Jordan's question, why would you talk about crime? Because the Conservatives have like a double-digit lead on crime in every poll I've ever fucking seen. That's why. And the same way that if the Conservatives decide to litigate an election campaign on healthcare, they're going to lose. It's the wrong issue set. Or on the environment, they're going to lose. It's the wrong issue set. No one is ever going to elect the Conservatives if the ballot question is who's going to do the most to prop up Medicare, right? Like, this is just not how it's going to be. And no one's going to elect the NDP if you want to deal with an issue with out of control crime in your community. They're the more the revolving door school in the mind of prisons, in the minds of the public, and that is deeply, deeply ingrained. And no leader in the course of a 6-week election campaign is going to flip the narrative on that for voters. I just don't believe that's true. If I were to counsel the NDP, I'd be talking about healthcare every single day, and I'd be talking about crime.
They're doing that.
But so why would Stevenson want to talk about crime? Yeah, she probably, like, if she could have the entire campaign be about that, irrespective of what position she held in a Palliser government, that's a good day for them. Like, there's a reason why the polls have tightened, and I think it's because they're getting, they're setting a narrative and an issue framework here that's largely to their benefit. And I think whoever wins that positioning battle generally wins the campaign. I also think it's going to be a very ugly campaign. A government that's been in office as long as they have, they don't get reelected out of love. They get reelected out of fear of the alternative and perceived risk around the alternative. So anything you can do to increase the perceived risk around an NDP government is going to be a benefit to the Conservatives. I do think there's, a caution that, we were looking at an ad that they ran a bit. The Stevenson campaign was pretty weak. And
speaking of likability.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was amazing how they presented her.
Well, like, I think it's off narrative. I think it's not genuine. It's not in keeping with what I think her actual personality is and what is appealing about her to the public. So, and something we preach about all the time on this show, which is, the harsh attack lines shouldn't be in the mouth of the leader. It makes you unlikable. I've never seen an attack ad where you have the leader go out and deliver a script with them, only them on camera. Like, it's borderline political malpractice. Like, it's just it's one of the worst fucking ads I've ever seen in my life.
Scott, what are you seeing going on out there?
I'll start with the ad just a segue. I also think it's one of the worst ads I've ever seen. I think strategically and tactically and execution wise, it's mind blowing. And I think they misunderstand what's happened over the course of the last 3-4 months. I think they realized the last 3-4 months that they had to get out of the business of presenting the premier as though she's the nicest person in politics, and therefore that makes her different. And therefore, the government ought to be reelected. That hasn't worked, and so they went negative. And this is an ugly negative, right? It's an ugly negative. There's another. Yes, they're ahead on crime, but it's also picking at the scab of Bob Canute's personal background. They're trying to prey on fears about First Nations. Can you trust this guy with the justice system? Can you trust this guy on these tough issues? All that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of dog whistling. But to then take that analysis and say, all right, well, that's helping to propel us forward. That's gotten this thing close. And now what we'll do is the lesson we take from that is that we have to show that the premier is tough. Actually, not tough. She has to be a shit. She has to be a shit. That is a mistake. They misunderstand their own strategic brief, and to portray her in that fashion, I think, was a real mistake. Unlikable isn't the same thing as strong, and I'm not sure that I'm not sure that strong was really what was working for them. I think what was working for them was playing on prejudices, and so I think two things. One, I think the Wab Kinew speech was an extraordinary piece of political craft, if you look at it. Like, it was really quite a thing, where he draws on his personal experience, knowing that it's going to come. Like, it's insufficient for him to just talk about healthcare. Sure, he'd love that campaign, but we live on planet Earth, and he knows that these ads are coming. He knows this argument's coming. He knows he's going to get, some of it will be surfaced, but a lot of it will be beneath the waters, and he knows it's coming. So he moved to insulate himself on that, takes ownership of his past, talks about what that journey means, and then lands on, and therefore basically, here's how you can trust the way that I will approach from a value standpoint and a political promise standpoint, the execution of the justice system as premier. And so, and the administration,
like the Obama speech after that pastor
Very
had
a little bit, very much.
Yeah,
So, and
a lot of
the
echoes of that.
Yeah, and so I thought it was an extraordinary piece of craft, strategically impressive, and his execution of it is impressive. And by the way, it takes a little courage to do shit like that. And there'll be a lot of people who will say, you know what, maybe we don't need to do this. Maybe it's just a little bit too putting ourselves in the jaw. And so I thought that was impressive. I also think. I think that their promises on electricity prices, I think their promises on energy prices are smart. I think that they are at minimum insulating themselves and arguably putting themselves in a position where they can try during an election period to move on economic issues and try to use them as a bat against a longtime incumbent government. I think we're going to have an ugly campaign. I think that you're going to see all kinds of shit thrown at Wab Kinew. I think there's going to be a lot of dog whistling on First Nations issues. I think it's going to be uncomfortable to watch, and I think that the Conservatives will lose. I bet they're at their high point now. And I bet that they win. And I'll just say this just to close, Kory. I think we'll see that the NDP will win, probably by a reasonable margin. I think the Conservatives are at their high point now. I think all they have is that negative campaign. They've done it. I don't think there's a lot more milk in that cow. And then I think the consequence, though, is you're going to end up with the city of Winnipeg will pick the premier, and the rest of the province will be Conservative. And it'll be a very uncomfortable divide.
I think that is very possible. I do want to take issue with this notion because I don't think it's true. B, I think it's if people actually think this, it's a strategic weakness that that somehow this is all just sort of under the surface racism, and that the only reason that you wouldn't that you'd have concerns around the NDP running the criminal justice system is that somehow
no, careful, Kory. That's not
you're
what
an undiagnosed racist. Well, that's sort of the issue, the way this is being presented. I think that there are real concerns. I think that what's more from the left of the party and perceived as being more from the left of the party. I think if Gary Dewar were the candidate, or someone like Gary Dewar were the candidate for the NDP, they would be walking away with it. But they're not. And, so there's reasons why this has tightened by almost 20 points over the last number of months. And it's not because he's doing a good job, I got to say.
Can I end Manitoba on? Oh, go ahead, Jordan. Finish.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, Kory, I disagree obviously with your characterization there. I think this is very much this is a discussion about the strategic choices the Stevenson campaign has made in terms of areas of focus. And I think anybody who says that there's not a racial undertone to the debate that's happening in Manitoba isn't really paying very close attention. And yes, the campaign would be different if it were Gary Dewar, because Gary Dewar is also a white man. So there's a lot happening under the surface
someone like Gary
there.
Dewar, and it wouldn't have to be that. Like, you can, look, your skin color doesn't determine everything in life and in politics. And there's lots of people who would be from a different part of the party, or could even be, Like, I don't attribute the racism as the primary motivating factor. Like, 20 points of people suddenly woke up and became racist all of a sudden that were supporting NDP, and now they're not. Like, how does one explain that? Those people who have moved their voter preference have done so for reasons other than race, I would say.
Well,
they were supporting NDP before, now they're not.
But
Jordan, rebuttal, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, but I would say, but what we do know is that the Stevenson campaign is touching on some of these tropes, and some of these issues around crime have certainly strayed into a territory where they go after Kinew personally for his own history. So I think folks can listen to Wab Kinew's remarks and make some of their own judgments. The last thing I want to say is to return to that ad that Stevenson did. And the topic, interestingly, of the ad, if you can get past the sort of nasty presentation. I
couldn't pay any attention to it.
Yeah. Well, it was supposed to be, of course, around public auto and the liquor board labor negotiations. And so one other element that's the strategic error of that for the Stevenson campaign is she is out there in the Premier's voice, basically talking down wages for Manitobans. And I think that type of an instinct is actually really risky and really could come back and bite them. And I think we're going to see a campaign play out that actually rewards a reflection on affordability issues as well as a discipline on message that you're starting to see from the NDP campaign there.
Scott A. Reid. Reid. Going on in this election campaign, neither of the two parties that are competing for government have even bothered to have a climate change plan. Neither one of them has any climate change targets of any that correspond to anything the federal government is talking about at all. And it is part of the Stevenson platform to get rid of the carbon tax. And it is part of the Canoe platform to kill the gas tax. Right?
Yep.
What does this tell you about how the climate issue is going to play out in a federal election?
Well, it tells us that at least in the Western provinces, people have reached a conclusion that either it's to your political benefit to campaign against these measures, or at minimum, is to your political benefit to be silent on these measures. That certainly championing these measures it's not a sword. It's not something that will carve out votes for you. And I think for the federal election, one of the critical questions is the Liberals federally have put themselves in a position where, and you and I have talked about this off mic, David, whether they can't even retreat from the carbon tax. Like they couldn't come forward and say, listen, affordability has become such an acute problem in this circumstance for until CPI is, for a period of 6 months below the 3-point margin, or, for a period of 4 years, we're suspending the carbon. They can't do something like that. They can't reverse it. Their identity is so linked to this policy. They probably don't wanna, but even if they came to the conclusion cravenly that they had to, I don't think they could get away with it. It wouldn't work for them. So they're stuck with it. But my conclusion is that climate policy is increasingly becoming something that you do in government because you must, but not something that you campaign on during elections because you think it will help consolidate your voter coalition or benefit you. And maybe that eases as economic conditions improve. But that's the truth of it. I mean, I think having a climate, at least carbon tax measures, I should say, really is what I'm really talking about is, if I had one fundamental desire as a Liberal, literally one, if I could pick one thing that I'd like, get in a time machine and go back and reverse something, I would pick the choice to campaign on a carbon tax as compared to cap and trade. I would just get in that time machine and go straight there.
2008, what a year.
Okay, so Gordon Pinsent, can you summon the audience for our Hey Yous, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Jordan, you've been away. You've had a lot of time to think about this. Give us a Hey You.
Well, in true Labor Day fashion, my Hey You is to the central bankers this week. As we stare down another decision point on a rate hike, I call to your attention a little letter sent by the Premier of BC. And this letter, probably folks have seen it, is calling on the central bank.
An endorsement of Pierre Poilievre. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's your
That's
Hey You. I'm not supposed to hear. Sorry.
Listen, you're surrounded, guys. You're surrounded. You have got folks coming on both sides of the spectrum now saying that a rate hike is the wrong thing to do. We had a surprise contraction in the latest reports. We may already be in a light recession. This is not the soft landing. And my Hey You is a recognition that though there are many who would wish that central banking and monetary policy lived in an ivory tower away from politics in the real world, it does not. And there is a need for political legitimacy in that system. And if the legitimacy is premised on the idea that you need to drive an economy into a recession and put people out of work and bankrupt them in order to retain central bank credibility, you are fucked. So that is my hey you heading into the announcement. And I hope they do the smart thing and keep rates where they are.
I think that was the play of the week, actually, at the provincial level. I thought EB's letter was the play of the week.
I think Ford released one this morning, didn't he? Didn't Ford echo it?
Yeah, I think he.
I'm not kidding. I thought he did.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, there were other premiers who were echoing.
And I think there are like a lot of premiers that will agree with that, right? Like I think there's a wide path there politically, and a lot of people agree. But I thought, to EB's credit, he was out first, and anyway.
Central Bank Governor Gerald Bowie destroyed the Trudeau administration in the early 1980s. Central Bank Governor John Crow destroyed the Mulroney administration and the PC party in the early 1990s. Tiff Macklem, come on down.
A proud historical tradition. I'm for the central bankers, by the way. I hope they keep.
Scott?
Somebody has to be, Scott. Somebody has to be.
Yeah, I am. You got it. Sorry. You're going to have to get a little castor oil if you want to clean that kitchen.
You got a hey you, brother?
Yeah, my hey you. Here on the occasion, we're recording this on Labor Day, and so I would say this. My hey you is to the CAW, as it was once known, the CAW, and to Judith Ann Reid, my mother. About 1989, 1990, I was in my second year of university. My mother got sick. And here's the truth. She never worked another day in her life. She's still with us. She's still kicking around, all that stuff, but she was too sick to go to work. And it was only because of the union. She worked at a CAW unionized plant, as did my father. And it was only because of the union that she had long-term disability pension, that she was able to keep her home as it was with the mortgage payments at the rate they were, that I was able to go to university because there was enough disposable income for me to actually be able to afford it. It just changed everything. Changed everything about our lives. If she had been sick and stayed sick like she did without a union job, we would have been fucked. I would now probably be working in Prince Edward County or Belleville, Ontario, as a construction laborer, which is what I used to do in the summers. That probably would have been my life. And you know what? Not a bad life. But I earn more now than either of my parents ever did, and that's almost entirely thanks to the union. So happy Labor Day.
Hear, hear.
Would have been the lippiest construction worker ever.
Would have been pushed off a roof in 1991.
Anyway, Bob White, he was the legendary head of the CAW.
Yep.
Yeah.
At that time.
Okay. Kory?
I'm gonna break from politics and I know you guys like talking rock and roll and music.
Yeah.
This weekend I went and saw the Smashing Pumpkins, and then last night I went and saw Guns N' Roses, and I've seen some like classic rock bands, like whether it's the Rolling Stones. I think we're going to go to Sting next week. Like, who go out and they play their hits and do a hell of a job, and everybody leaves there happy. And then there's some people who play for like the Rolling Stones did, or Guns N' Roses did yesterday, like for 3 hours, and look like they resent having to play any of the songs that brought their audience there. Just terrible. Like a hot tip for aged rock stars: go on Spotify, see where all your downloads are. If you're going to play a 12-song set, pick those 12 songs, play them. Everyone will be happy. Anyway, it was a real miss by both the Smashing Pumpkins and GNR, sadly.
Hey, Jimmy Buffett played Margaritaville with a smile on his lips his whole goddamned life and turned it into $1 billion.
$1 billion.
All the way to the bank.
All those parrot heads. Yeah.
I personally am shocked that Guns N' Roses suck right now.
I think the tour, in fairness, was called "We Blew All Our Money on Drugs" tour. I felt like they had to be there, not that they wanted to be there. Anyway.
This is why you guys should all become Swifties. The Eras tour is like no lose.
I can't afford to be a Swiftie. I can't make enough money to go to a Taylor Swift concert.
I don't have a union job.
She's going to single-handedly lift up our GDP.
I know. It's crazy.
Kory, I was once at a Bob Dylan concert, and there's two guys behind me, and one guy says to the other guy, "What song is he singing right now?"
Yeah.
And the other guy says, "I don't know. What language is he singing it in?"
I was one of the people in the audience in both concerts yelling out, "Play a hit! Play a hit!"
All right, my hey you My hey you goes out to every Canadian politician jumping at the issue of telling schools they must seek the consent of parents before using different pronouns for kids. You are pathetic. Climate change, cost of living, housing availability, poverty are the consuming issues of our time. Having nothing to say on these matters, you seek refuge in a made-up issue that inflames anti-gay and lesbian attitudes. Shame on you, and go back and do your actual job. Hey you. All right. That's our show for this week. I want to thank all three of you for being back together. I want to thank Jake Dolagala, and I want to thank Nick Marshall, and I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN Rail, and all of you who watched or listened. Thanks for this, and we'll see you next week with more of the Curse of Politics and perhaps Kory in a better space. See you then.